Let's take a look now at Southeast Asia since 1945. Southeast Asia. We want to take a look starting off with Japan. We've talked about Japan before, obviously in World War II. What happens after World War II? Of course, Japan defeated by the United States, primarily in World War II. At the end of the war, Japan is in ruins. Cities are destroyed. The United States has occupied Japan, and big problems in Japan. However, 50 years later, Japan is the second greatest industrial power in the world. How did this happen? How does this take place? Well, the United States occupies Japan for about 5 years and goes through a process of sort of, well, like in Germany, we had the denazification of Germany that took place. In Japan, they're going to want to remove sort of the cult of the emperor and the sort of war machine imperialistic approach of the Japanese. And so that's really what's going to happen. It's going to come under the command of the guy on the picture here of Time magazine, General Douglas MacArthur, who had been in the Pacific realm and the Philippines and who had been involved in World War II. He's now going to be assigned to oversee the occupation of Japan and this sort of transformation of Japan, demilitarization of Japan and tearing down their war machine, overseeing trials for war crimes, of which there were many. The Japanese had used prisoners of war as slaves and had carried out a lot of terrible things, and so these trials were put in place. People, it seems, saw MacArthur as a conquering general or shogun, if you know the history of Japan. We've mentioned this before, that they had a shogunate, and this is the idea that the general makes decisions and runs. So this is something which was in Japanese history, culture, and so now they see MacArthur much in that way. The Allies and those advisors to MacArthur felt that the Meiji Constitution had led to the empire, and this was a process whereby Japan was going to become more westernized, but do it in a Japanese way. And they was expansionist and it was imperialist, and so they wanted to change this. And in fact, there will be a new constitution written for Japan, which I think I said that right. It was sort of written for them. There was very little input by the Japanese, and this constitution comes into play to try to change Japan into a more pluralistic model, not so much Japanese first completely, and to get rid of some of those ideas. The textbooks are changed to remove the propaganda had been put into place in which those felt promoted the kind of imperialism that we see in Japan from say 1895 to 1945. And purposely, American culture was encouraged, and it certainly has had a lasting impact. The Japanese are great fans of baseball. This is when this happens. And in fact, we now have Japanese players who are coming into the major leagues in the United States, but of course they have their own league in Japan. Things like Coca-Cola, bubble gum, the music of America, especially in the 1950s and 60s and so forth. Many other things of American culture. I mean, even Christmas time, Santa Claus, things that don't really fit so much religiously with Japan, but culturally have been incorporated in large measure because of this period of occupation. Well, one of the things that we need to try to understand Japan since 1945 and the tremendous growth of their economy and so forth is a word that's called zabatsu. Zaibatsu. Uh, Zaibatsu is a large business conglomerate. In other words, it's a business, a corporation, but it's mainly owned usually by a family, maybe controlled by one family member or members of a family, and they will have several divisions. So it'd be one giant company that's doing a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. These conglomerates or corporations or companies end up having a lot of influence on the government, and this was the buildup from say 1895 to 1945, because the Japanese really built their economy from 1895 to 1945, and this is a large reason why. But they also had a lot of influence in the military, in the government, and in business. And so they end up being the ones who create, let's say, the weapons of war, the machinery of war, and make sure that their stuff is purchased and makes it into the battlefield and so forth. There were big four zaibatsu that are there during this period. You'll recognize at least one name, I think, Mitsubishi, uh, Sumitomo, Yashudu, and Mitsui. Um, these were controlling much of the economy before World War II and even during World War II. They had diverse interests like mining, chemical production, processing, metal ores, metal mining, and so forth, machinery, equipment, commercial shipping, in ships, shipbuilding, stocks. But the occupational forces attempt to dissolve these large conglomerates. They didn't completely achieve it, but they did modify it to some degree. Um, Part of the reason I think they didn't end up stamping it out completely is because later on, the United States, as they begin to see, hey, if we get rid of all of this, Japan's going to be economically weak. And of course, this might open the door for communists to move into Japan, say like they were in China, and how they'll end up in Korea, North Korea, North Vietnam, and so forth. So they actually left some of this intact, although modified it. Now, September of 1951, at Pivotal, takes place in San Francisco. There is a treaty that is signed by Japan and the Allies who fought against Japan, which actually brings a formal end to Japanese occupation and brings about independence. And as for that, I mean, in return for Japan agreeing, getting its independence, they have to agree that they would give up and renounce any claims that they might have, these sort of imperialistic territories that they had controlled. For example, like Taiwan, which they had controlled for many years, Korea, the Kuril Islands, which they had taken from the Russians, and so forth. And also, within this, and within their constitution that was written a couple years before, there was a prohibition of creating any military force. They could only have a defense force. Sort of renouncing war and that sort of thing, and having just the Japanese defense forces, which is what you see pictured here. And here's a book about Zaibatsu. So we see then, as also a part of this agreement, the United States would provide a military defense for the Japanese, for the Japan self-defense forces, would rely upon the United States heavily. So this is the agreement that is drawn up. Now, on the one hand, while Japan is not allowed to have a military, I guess you want to look, maybe that's not a positive, but what is a positive is they don't have to pay for a military. You know, the United States spends an awful lot of money on the military, and so do many other countries. Japan doesn't have to spend a lot of money on any military. They have this, of course, self-defense force, but they don't have a lot of other things like that. Now, the United States pushes a democracy and multi-party politics. And there are multiple parties, but what finally emerges are two major political parties: the Socialist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party, or the LDP. Now, it turns out, really, while there are multiple parties, it's the Liberal Democratic Party is the one which has dominated Japanese politics for much of the last, 60, more than 60 years. Since 1955, they have controlled the politics within Japan. So since World War II, we see great economic change, growth within Japan. Oh, by the way, these two things are symbols of the, this is a little logo, and this is sort of the flag of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. We'll mention who that is in the corner here in a moment. But at any rate, there is this Japanese miracle, as it's called. For example, in 1950, the gross national product, the GNP of Japan, that's a measure of what a country produces, is 1/3 of either Great Britain or France. It's very small. 30 years later, in 1980, the GNP of Japan is larger than the economies, the GNP of Great Britain and France put together. That's a tremendous change in really a relatively short amount of time. Now, while the Zabatsu is no longer allowed and has been sort of broken up, but the Keiretsu is still allowed. And it's sort of a bit weaker approach to it, but the same idea. What it literally means is interlocking arrangement. A cooperation between suppliers, wholesalers, retailers, and the banks, and working closely with the government. This is part of the reason why Japan really surges from, let's say, 1950 to 1990s at least. The other thing is, too, is they had some land reforms. They encouraged private farming, and they gave, they sort of gave access to land to people who didn't have it. This created for some very prosperous farms and farmers, while the government, of course, is playing a role in business. So for many, they thought, well, this looks like a good model, and it was very good for 40 years or more. But in the 1990s, the Japanese economy began to slip. I don't know. Part of it was corruption, I suppose. Part of it was, protectionism of the government. They had a lot of embargoes, things that could not be imported into Japan, which then began to be retaliated against by others. Since they're a relatively small country, they don't have a lot of consumers to buy up their products. And so we've seen a real change in Japan, let's say in the past 20 years or so. The conformity of Japan, which had been sort of the hallmark of these large Japanese corporations, is beginning to break down. Everybody wants a job with the big companies. Not everybody can get a job with the big companies. And so this makes several feel like they are left out. And conformity begins to lead to individualism or rebellion, especially of the younger people. One of the things is this idea of what they call tea hair. You see this young lady here has her hair brown or bleached, bleached out from the very dark hair that most Japanese have. And she has this kind of a brownish reddish color. This is caused by bleaching or dyeing. And of course, this became very popular. And in fact, the schools and authorities would sort of force young people not to do that to their hair. But of course, they still would do it when they got out of school. But then if you wanted to get a job, it was frowned upon if you wanted a job at one of these big companies. So you just see a real shift there in Japan, and we'll have to wait and see what happens now going forward. I want to talk next about what are sometimes called little tigers. You can see on this map, here is Japan up here. And of course, here's China. But I want to talk about 4 small countries, some of them quite small, that have made a great impact. By the way, you see here the world's regions by total wealth. And you can see that today, Asia and Pacific, you see at 56.7, Europe 85.4, the United States 106.5, China 51.9. And then, of course, Latin America, India, Africa. So as you can see, the lion's share of this is the United States and Europe. But growing, of course, is Asia Pacific and China, and I think India as well. This is why, one of the things I guess I haven't said yet that many people see as they look back on history is that the 19th century, that is the 1800s, were dominated by the Europeans, Europe. So some people call it a European century. The 20th century was dominated by the United States. So some people call it an American century. The 21st century, and we're now 20 years into it, out of the 100 years, right? Many people see this as perhaps going to be a Pacific century, an Asian century, that things are going to shift to Asia Pacific, and China. These 2 squares here, and probably also India growing too. These will become the major players in the world. So we'll see. I mean, I have been telling students for 30 years. Wow. Yeah, I guess so. That they should learn Chinese. You already know English, I hope. And if you learn Chinese, you're going to really set yourself up for a good position in the future. Because the largest populations in the world is China and India. India already, many people there speak English already. And in China, if you could learn, say, Mandarin, you could get involved in business and law and all sorts of other ventures. If not you, certainly your children. Well, anyway, let's talk about these little tigers. Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Those are the 4 little tigers. Korea, you see, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore down here. Okay, now these are sort of following the Japanese model of what we talked about with the businesses being connected to the government, and they're sort of following this kind of capitalism and challenging the Western world in business, and they have made a tremendous impact over the last 60 years or so. The other thing, too, that shows up in a lot of the thinking about Asia, China, but also these little tigers, and probably also, it's kind of in the thinking of it, the influence of Confucius. And if you remember when we talked about China, I said that one of the reasons why the government of China really pushed the teachings of Confucius is that Confucius taught that you should do hard work. You should work hard. You should respect the authority. You should not be controlled by possessions, that sort of thing. And that kind of hard work attitude You could sort of relate it to the Protestant work ethic of the West. I don't know if I think we've talked about the Protestant work ethic, but if not, we will right now. This is the idea that sort of comes up around Calvinism, the teachings of Calvin, that you're among the elect. Some people are among the elect and some people are not among the elect. How do you know if you're among the elect? Well, you know you're among the elect if God is blessing you. This is one of the ways. So you want to be among the elect, so that means you want to be blessed, you want to prosper, you want to do that kind of thing. So it sort of motivates you to work hard, to get ahead, and by doing that, you show that you're being blessed by God, and you show, therefore, that you are among the elect. I mean, this kind of thinking affected the West, certainly the United States, England, and other places that had Protestant faith. And the teachings of Confucius have some similar ideas there, that you should work hard, respect authority, get a good education, be thrifty, that sort of thing. Well, I think one of the things that this shows, whether it's Japan or these little tigers, that I don't think your textbook directly says, is that you see how productive these areas can be when they're not under the thumb of communism. China has made a lot of improvements as of lately, but they are a huge country with huge amounts of resources, and some of these tiny areas have actually done a tremendous job. Well, anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about each of these four little tigers. First of all, Korea. Now, one of the things to remember about the Korean Peninsula, and by the way, where is it? It's right here. It's this one right here. That's the Korean Peninsula. Of course, you remember we've talked about it before. It's divided north to south. Well, before it was divided like that, it was actually controlled by Japan for 35 years, from 1910 to 1945 to the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, then, it gets involved in the aftermath of World War II. The United States is going to lead the fight against Japan. And one of the things that they believed is that they would need help with defeating Japan and invading Japan. And so they worked with their ally, the Soviet Union, the USSR. But of course, once the United States had developed the nuclear bomb, an amphibious assault on Japan was no longer necessary. So it made the Soviet part of this, not nearly as big. But basically, the Soviets wanted Manchuria, which was part of China, and they also moved down into Korea. So at the end of the war, the Soviet Union towards the end of the war, declares war on Japan. They were not at war with Japan until August of 1945. And then they invade North Korea, basically to push the Japanese out. We invade the South to push the Japanese out. And so we have a situation where the Soviets are in the north, the United States and Allied forces in the south. And it sets it up for problems. And we've talked about the Korean War in here before, where basically the North, two governments are established when unity cannot come because of two different styles of government, communist government in the North, democratic government in the South. And so once those two governments are established and the U.S. and the USSR forces pull out in 1949, within just a couple of months, 6 weeks, something like that, North Korea invades South Korea with the approval from the Soviets. And so they march across and they sweep down and they take most of the country. Then UN forces under the United States pushes them back, and we're not going to go through the details of the war, but for the next 3 years, roughly 2.5 to 3 years, there's a lot of fighting there, and it ends up still with a North and a South divided. along the 38th parallel. It had been, but now there is a demarcation line pretty close to that. So the country is divided almost in half. And that's the way it's been since 1953. So what, 60, 70 years. And the United States still has sends troops there, patrols the demilitarized zone. It's a very tense situation because in the north, you have the guys that are pictured here have been in charge. Okay, so let's talk about that. They've been ruled by communist dictators. The first one is the guy up here in the upper right corner, Kim Il-sung, who rules from 1948 to 1994. He's sometimes called the Great Leader and was president of North Korea. And when he dies, of course, it then goes to his son, Kim Jong-il, who's sometimes called the Dear Leader. But he's not the president. The office of president was eliminated, and now he is called, or he was called, the Supreme Leader of North Korea. When he dies in 2011, then his son comes into power, Kim Jong-un. And you've probably heard of him. He is sometimes called the Marshal, and he is Supreme Leader of North Korea. Now, one of the things that he's been doing, of course, is trying to develop nuclear weapons and, of course, developing missiles that can, the missiles can attack areas near Korea, and is even trying to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could hit the United States. So this is a real hot spot for the United States. North Korea is sometimes called the Hermit Kingdom, in a close relationship with China, but almost no one gets in or out of North Korea. They are known to have the worst human rights record in the world. They are an atheistic communist state with a terrible economy and a repressive government. Huge spending. What money they do get, they spend it on their military and their missile program and on lavish living. For example, Kim Jong-un, the guy over here, according to Dennis Rodman, the basketball player, the former basketball player for the Bulls, since Kim Jong-un loves basketball, he's created a friendship. There's a friendship between him and Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman has spent time with him probably more than anybody else in the West, and he's taken him places and so forth with him. He says that Kim Jong-un has 17 luxury palaces, 100 luxury cars, a 100-foot yacht, a private jet, and even a private island that Dennis Rodman had visited. And so there's plenty of spending there, but many of the people of Korea are actually starving. So that's the North Korea side. South Korea, you see, was ruled by a strongly anti-communist president named Syngman Rhee, who was criticized for being too autocratic, that is, too controlling. And eventually, in 1960, a revolt comes against him, 12 years after he becomes president, led by students. We see eventually, in the midst of this upheaval, a military coup takes over in May in 1961, and General Park Chung-hee will become the ruler of South Korea, president of South Korea, until his assassination in 1979. And the politics of South Korea are difficult to follow. They are really, to be honest with you, kind of a mess, because there's a lot of upheaval, there's a lot of corruption that's going on here, but at the same time, the economy is going up, way up. So General Park Chung-hee becomes very controversial because he is also very autocratic. Right? He is actually assassinated by a close friend and director of the Korean CIA, who orchestrates all of this with some other leaders of related to General Park Chung-hee's administration, and he shoots them. He kills about 3 or 4 people, and he, of course, is later convicted and executed for treason. But General Kim builds the economy. I have this picture here. This is a picture of Seoul, South Korea. You can see how modern it looks, how built up it is. And then down here at the bottom, maybe you can read what's there, but basically it's just starting about 1950 and going to 2016. This red line is Korea, North Korea. Notice very flat, no real growth. Here is South Korea, this blue line, and look at its growth over the same period. Some people call this the miracle on the Han River. Okay. Upheaval led to a coup in 1980, and Chung Do-hwan becomes president. And since the 1980s, there's just so much corruption. I'm not even going to go through all of it for you and list each one of the different presidents for you. I'll talk about a couple of them, but there's just been a lot of corruption involving these business chaebols, these sort of same kind of thing like they have in Japan, where the government is involved with the business, and it's really caused the economy to grow, but it's also created a way for politicians to really benefit from this as well in corruption and bribery, and they're being bribed by these companies. This has led to the impeachment of, I think, 3 leaders since 1980, and imprisonment and or suicide of 3 or 4 of these leaders. For example, Roh Moon-hyun, who is president from 2003 to 2008, was implicated in a corruption scandal involving money, first starting with his family. He was starting to draw him into this. This is after he'd left office, and he will actually commit suicide, what it seems to be a suicide, where he jumped off a part of a mountain, a cliff, near his property, his private property. He left a suicide note on his computer. So, some people think, no, he was assassinated, but others believe it really was a suicide, but in the midst of scandal. And then a very recent president, we'll jump to Park Geun-hye, who was president from 2013 to 2017. She is the daughter of Park Chung-hee. You remember him? He was the guy that was assassinated in '79. She is his daughter, and in fact, her mother was also assassinated when there was a failed attempt to assassinate her father, but her mother was shot and died. And then she, that is Park Geun-hye, the daughter, helps her father and kind of becomes the hostess and the confidant of her father after her mother's assassination. And then, of course, after her father is assassinated, he's quite controversial, she will get involved in politics herself. She is actually elected president in 2013, becoming the first female Asian ruler ever. But she gets involved in a scandal involving a cult leader who her father knew, kind of a weird mix between Buddhism and also Christianity. And so we see that Moon Jae was impeached and was put on trial and was sentenced to bribery charges and corruption charges, sentenced to 25 years in prison. And Moon Jae-in was elected president. He's the former aide of the guy that committed suicide. So this is where it stands for today. But tremendous growth economically in South Korea. So let's talk about these chaebols, these industrial conglomerates, somewhat like what we talked about with Japan. These are industrial conglomerates, business conglomerates owned by a family, maybe one person or a group. You can see the picture here. This is the largest, Samsung, which I'm sure you've heard of, makers of electronics, but many, many other things as well. And here you see down below Hyundai. This is of course, they make automobiles, but they make a lot of other things as well. And then here you can see all the divisions of it and how these are each led by a family member. Samsung in this very modern part of Seoul, in fact near what's called Gangnam Station, which you might have heard about, and it's even called Samsung Town. So for example, Samsung, which is the largest of these, has food processing, textiles, insurance, securities, retail, construction, shipbuilding, of course electronics and mobile phones, which you probably know, semiconductors, computer chips. They have a theme park, and they have an advertising company. This is the largest of these groups in Korea. Hyundai Group, of course you know, for the cars and motor department, but they also have heavy industry and many other things as well, controlled by Chung Yu-young, and then you see all of his children who are heads of different divisions. Other big groups like this in Korea are LG and Kia. And when Kia got into some financial problems a few years ago, Hyundai actually bought out about 30 or 40% of it. Well, these chaebols have created a great economic situation for Korea, and really shows the tremendous growth of their economy. But of course, as we've already mentioned, since 1980, it has also been involved with a lot of scandalous stuff with the politicians getting involved in bribery and influence peddling, that sort of thing. Let's move on. We got a couple more screens here, and let's move on to Taiwan. Taiwan. From 1895 to 1945, Taiwan is controlled by Japan. The Japanese end up calling Taiwan Formosa. And if you look on this map here, you can see that Taiwan is an island off of the coast of China. And of course, it gets involved with the civil war that takes place in China that we've already talked about after World War II, where the republic, that is the government of China, has to fight off rebels, communist rebels. They lose Beijing, they move to Nanjing, Canton, and so forth. Eventually, as you can see here, they move to the island of Taiwan, to the city of Taipei. And here's a picture of modern Taipei. This was meant to be temporary, and the hopes were they were going to come back and control all of China again. But they set up their capital in 1949 in Taipei. Now, they're ruled by Chiang Kai-shek, the same guy who was in charge back on mainland China, and he will rule in Taiwan until 1975 when he dies. His son after him will rule until 1988. And so we see this kind of continuity that's there. Now, one of the things that helps out Taiwan, because I think a lot of people assume mainland China would just take over Taiwan in due course. That didn't happen, and in large measure it didn't happen because of the Cold War. When Chiang Kai-shek, basically we kind of abandoned him. We had come to his aid. We abandoned him when we no longer needed help for an amphibious assault on Japan. And so we'll see in 1954, there was a security treaty made with the United States. This security treaty basically is going to help preserve Taiwan and means that the United States will, in fact, come to their defense, send the, I think it's the 7th Fleet down there and do military maneuvers and basically sort of let the communist Chinese know that we were in the area. This is part of the idea of trying to keep communism from coming to Taiwan. This is all bolstered, of course, by the Korean War, which wasn't too far away, the Cold War, the Vietnam War. But, of course, during that process, a lot of trade and manufacturing will take place. The standard of living in Taiwan becomes much greater than that in mainland China. But Communist China, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, still claims that Taiwan is a part of China and that it is theirs. And the United States has been distancing themselves from Taiwan for several years, starting, I think, with the 1970s when Nixon goes to China and mainland China, the People's Republic, and begins to make inroads there. One of the things that has to happen is, of course, we have to back away from Taiwan. You see this happening in 1971 when the government at Taipei in Taiwan of China, the Republic of China, is replaced by the People's Republic of China in the United Nations. So right now, Taiwan has no representation at the United Nations, and they haven't had it now since 1971. Political parties in Taiwan are split over this idea of reunification and independence. And so right now, the people in charge are very much wanting to be independent. Of course, this doesn't sit too well with the People's Republic of China. But one thing that is true is that Taiwan has had a tremendous economic growth using the same kind of models we've been talking about here. And as you can see, this Taipei, very modern city. Two more screens. We've got Singapore. Singapore has an interesting history. British rule begins there all the way back in 1819 and will continue until the Japanese actually invade and take it over in 1942 and will rule from 1942 to 1945. Given some of the problems that occur there, the people in Singapore begin to think maybe they need to be aligned with Malaysia, and so they are for just a couple of years. But when Malaysia wants to be quite restrictive, they basically pull out of that agreement and they become an independent republic in 1965, and they align themselves with the British as part of the British Commonwealth. And the British Commonwealth is a whole list, I think it's about 50 or 60 countries that were former British colonies that have aligned themselves in a trade agreement and, a sort of historic agreement, which is called, that's why it's the United Kingdom. It's part of the Commonwealth of Britain. And so it has been that since 1965. Now, politically, the People's Action Party, the PAP, controls the government, especially the guy pictured here. His name is Lee Kuan Yew, who helped form the PAP, and he becomes the prime minister and leader and shaping Singapore from 1959 to 1990, and developed, takes it from being a developing third world country to a developed first world country. I mean, take a look at this picture. Look at the tremendous growth here in Singapore. Singapore has focused its business on oil refineries, electronics, shipbuilding, finance and banking, tourism. These are things where they have made a tremendous amount of money. And we now see the son of Lee Kuan Yew has now become the prime minister since 2004, and he's begun to relax some of the restrictions on free speech and assembly, and we see Singapore seems poised to continue to have great growth in the future. Let's move to our last screen then, to our little tiger, our last one. We're going to talk about Hong Kong. Hong Kong, as you can see, it's a peninsula and groups of islands connected to mainland China. What happens to Hong Kong is that the British take control of part of this area in 1842, more of it in 1860, and even more in 1898. And it comes as a result of the Opium Wars. And we talked about those earlier, where China is very weak in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And we see that the British are able to negotiate and take control of this. So in 1898, the British make a deal with China that they will have control of Hong Kong for 99 years. And they do, until 1997. So a very unique situation here. But Hong Kong is a free trade zone, a free trade city, and it's a place where basically there are no restrictions, sort of government restrictions on deals and tariffs, and it's a sort of a tax haven. The whole thing is there, and that's really caused it to explode. So you can see the picture of it here. Just a huge conglomerate of cities, very, very modern, greatly prosperous. And of course, they also had access to China nearby, where there was cheap labor available. But it's interesting to note that this part of China, which is closest to Hong Kong, is also the most prosperous part of China. I mean, as far as living, the people who live there have a much better standard of living. And so in Hong Kong, yes, they had this free trade, but they also built infrastructure, universities, colleges, schools, transportation, sanitation, housing. All of these things they made a priority. China, when Britain turned it over to them in 1997, it was very controversial. A lot of people in Hong Kong felt that the communist Chinese would just come in and take over immediately and subdue Hong Kong. The Chinese had promised for 50 years that they would let Hong Kong basically be self-governing. So that would take it out to what, 2047. And of course, we're almost 30 years away from that. But it appears that, of course, communist China has been trying to get involved in a kind of way, a lot in trade and business. But the free capitalism and free approach of Hong Kong, they've used it somewhat to their advantage over the past 20 years. But it also, they feel, I think some of them feel, it encourages other people in China to want to be more like Hong Kong, and they think that might create problems for them. At any rate, they've begun to sort of crack down a bit on it, and this has led to protesters who are challenging, for example, their lack of free speech and the way that mainland China is beginning to impose some things on them. So you may have heard on the news that over the past year and a half or so, there have been a lot of student protests, demonstrations, clashes with police. Pretty widespread in 2019 and the beginning of 2020. It's over police misconduct and freedom and privacy. But one of the things that we see for sure is that Hong Kong is a place that has economically just exploded. So again, we're not sure what's going to come of it in the coming years as China takes more and more control there. All right, we're going to end it there.